Hey everyone, close your eyes for a second. Picture a small, isolated farm in the middle of nowhere. It's 1922, deep in the German countryside, in Bavaria. The world is trying to move on from a devastating war, but out here, life is simple, harsh, and quiet. Now, imagine that quiet is shattered, not by a sudden storm, but by an unseen horror. A monster walking in the shadows. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck, a place so remote, so normal, and so terrifying that nearly a century later, it remains one of the most famous, most chilling, and most baffling unsolved murder mysteries in history. 6 people, a whole family and their maid, brutally slaughtered in their home on a cold night with a pickaxe. And the most sickening part? The killer, or killers, might have been living on the farm with the family for days, maybe even weeks, before the massacre. Everything about this case is strange. The sounds, the footsteps in the snow, the missing key, the strange discovery, and the horrifying silence that followed. Get ready. This is Hinterkaifeck. The family that lived on the Hinterkaifeck farm was called Gruber. There was old Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, and his wife Casilia, both in their 60s. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived with them, along with her 2 young children. Casilia, a 7-year-old girl named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. And then there was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid who had only arrived at the farm a few hours earlier, on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922. The farm itself was a lone cluster of buildings, a farmhouse, a large barn, and a few small sheds, tucked away near the small village of Grobern, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. It was remote. The word Hinterkaifeck itself roughly translates to behind the little copse. It was literally behind the rest of the world. Neighbors were a good mile or more away, and the people of Grobern kept their distance. The Grubers weren't exactly popular. Andreas Gruber had a dark reputation for being tyrannical and controlling, and there had been whispers, sickening rumors, about an incestuous relationship between him and his daughter, Victoria, which was the cause of great scandal in the small, pious community. But whether the family was respected or reviled, what happened to them was an atrocity that shocked the whole country. And the strange thing is, the terror didn't begin on the night of the murders. It had been creeping up on them for months, like a slow-moving cloud of dread. Just a few weeks before the massacre, Andreas Gruber was talking to neighbors about strange happenings on the farm. He had found footsteps in the fresh snow, leading right from the nearby woods to the back door of the house. But there were no footprints leading away. Just the distinct, clean tracks of someone coming, but not leaving. The snow had been undisturbed everywhere else. The footsteps had simply vanished. Gruber had searched the property, but found nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching them. A few days after the footprints, Gruber noticed something else disturbing. The house key, the main key to the entire property, went missing. He tore the place apart, checked every pocket and drawer, but it was gone. He was so paranoid that he didn't even tell anyone but his family. Then came the noises. A week before the murders, Casilia, the 7-year-old, told her school friends that she was afraid because her father, Andreas, had heard sounds coming from the attic. Not just one night, but for several nights in a row. Thumps, shuffles, and small creaks, as if someone was moving around up there, right over their heads. When Andreas went to check, the attic was always empty. He assumed a stray animal, maybe a squirrel, but deep down, he knew the sounds were too purposeful for an animal. That feeling of being watched, of being invaded, was growing stronger and stronger. The final night arrived, March 31st. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, settled in, hoping for a fresh start. No one in that house, not the old man, the children, or the new maid, suspected that the watcher was no longer just watching. He was already inside. The atmosphere on the Hinterkaifeck farm had been thick with anxiety long before the footsteps in the snow appeared. It had always been a tense household, ruled by the demanding nature of Andreas Gruber. The maid who preceded Maria Baumgartner had left abruptly only 6 months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. She said she couldn't stand the constant feeling of someone following her, or the unexplained whispers she heard when she was alone. The Grubers dismissed her as hysterical, but her sudden departure left a gap that was hard to fill. People in the area were wary of the family, and even more wary of the isolated farm itself. On the last day of the family's life, things seemed to proceed with an unnerving normality. Joseph, the 2-year-old, spent the day playing with his older sister, Kazilia. Victoria, their mother, was busy with farm chores, and the old Grubers were settling into their evening routine. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived in the early afternoon, perhaps around 3 or 4 p.m. She would have been shown her room, likely in the main farmhouse, and then immediately put to work. A farmhand later testified that he saw the family on the afternoon of the 31st, helping bring in feed, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They looked tired, yes, but normal. However, the strange occurrences were piling up, seemingly reaching a crescendo. A few days before the murders, Andreas Gruber's glasses went missing. A small thing, but for a meticulous and suspicious man like Gruber, it was another sign of intrusion. He couldn't find them anywhere. Even more bizarre, a few weeks before that, an unknown man had tried to sell the Grubers a dog, but they refused. This man had spent an unusual amount of time examining the farm, studying the layout of the fields and the house itself, before leaving without another word. The interaction was brief, but in retrospect, it felt like reconnaissance. Little Kazilia, the 7-year-old, was a bright, curious child. Before she went to school on that Friday, the 31st, she showed her friends a small, shiny silver locket she had found on the ground in the farmyard. It was an old locket, not belonging to anyone in the family. The kids played with it, a small distraction before the final bell. No one ever saw that locket again, nor was it found during the extensive search of the property after the murders. It was another unsettling detail, one small piece of evidence that someone unknown had been at the farm very recently. The evening of the 31st was cold and clear. Neighbors, who were quite a distance away, later reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse late into the night. This suggested the family was home and had a fire going. They were settled in for the night. The last verifiable sighting of any member of the Gruber-Gabriel family was late afternoon. As the darkness fell, the farm became a silent, solitary island under the Bavarian sky, completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was a perfect, isolated stage for the horror that was about to unfold. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the unseen menace was lurking, waiting for its cue. The exact time of the murders is one of the many secrets the Hinterkaifeck farm took to its grave. Investigators later estimated the time of death to be late in the evening, perhaps around 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. on Friday, March 31st. The killer, or killers, had a clear plan, perfect knowledge of the property, and apparently, an incredible amount of control and luck. The victims were not attacked all at once, which is one of the most chilling aspects of the crime. The assault began not in the warmth of the farmhouse, but outside, in the barn. It is believed that Andreas Gruber, the old man, was lured out first. Perhaps he heard a noise in the stable, or maybe the familiar sound of his animals being disturbed. Given his suspicious nature and the recent strange events, it's easy to imagine him grabbing a lantern and heading toward the barn to investigate. He was likely the first one ambushed. The murder weapon was a mattock, a German pickaxe, found later in the attic, covered in blood. The brutality was extreme. A powerful, swift blow, or multiple blows, to the head. Victoria Gabriel, his daughter, was the next victim. Like her father, she must have been tricked into stepping outside, possibly by a distressed cry or the killer whispering Gruber's name. As she stepped into the barn, she too was struck down, quickly and viciously. Next was the elder Kazilia Gruber, the grandmother. Hearing the commotion, or perhaps noticing her husband and daughter's absence, she followed them into the dark, silent barn. And like the two before her, she met the same fate, ambushed and silenced with the heavy, blunt end of the mattock. Finally, the 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel, hearing the sounds or waking up to the awful silence, made her way to the barn. She was small, but no less a witness. She was murdered last among the adults. This sequence, for people, one after the other, lured into the same dark space and brutally dispatched, suggests a calculated killer operating with terrifying efficiency and absolute silence. The killer then went back into the house. 2 people remained, the 2-year-old Joseph and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. Joseph was sleeping in his crib in his mother's bedroom. He was killed next. He was found with severe head trauma, but his body was notably covered by his crib blanket, suggesting a shred of humanity or perhaps a horrifying pause by the killer. Finally, the maid, Maria, who had only been in the house a few hours, was in her room, likely sleeping. She was the last to die, receiving a tremendous blow to her head. The most shocking realization is that all 6 people were killed within a short period, and yet, no one screamed. No one ran. The neighbors, miles away, heard nothing. The only sounds that night were the muffled thuds of the pickaxe, followed by a profound, grotesque silence. And in that silence, the killer remained. The murders were over, but the story of the Hinterkaifeck monster was only just beginning. The murders occurred on Friday night, March 31st, but for 4 long days, no one outside the farm knew. The killer, or killers, didn't just disappear after the horrific act. They stayed. This is one of the most chilling and disturbing aspects of the Hinterkaifeck case. Someone lived in that house with the 6 dead bodies for an extended period, carrying out daily chores, eating food, and keeping warm by the fire. On Saturday, April 1st, neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney. The cattle were fed, and their mooing could be heard. Someone was clearly still tending to the farm animals. The killer even prepared meals in the kitchen, eating the family's food. Evidence later found by investigators suggested that recently opened tins of food were present in the pantry, and freshly cut meat was found on a kitchen table. They even used the bed in the master bedroom, leaving behind evidence that someone had slept there. Little Kazilia, the 7-year-old, missed school on Saturday. This was unusual for her, as she was a diligent student. The teacher, her Haas, noticed her absence but didn't think much of it at first. It was a Saturday, after all, and farm children sometimes had chores. But by Monday, April 3rd, her continued absence became a concern. No one from the Gruber family appeared in the village, which was also strange. The mail had piled up in the mailbox, unopened. The local repairman, Albert Hoffner, had been scheduled to come to the farm on Saturday to fix a broken engine, but no one answered the door when he arrived. He waited for an hour, hearing only the sounds of the farm animals, but seeing no one. He thought the family must have left for a short trip, which was out of character for the Grubers. The farm dog, a loyal sheepdog, was found tied up in the yard, looking gaunt and neglected, but still alive. The cats, however, were nowhere to be found, a detail that many found unsettling. It was as if everything that could make a sound, aside from the livestock, had been silenced or driven away. The sheer audacity of the killer to remain on the premises, performing normal farm duties, is almost unbelievable. It shows a level of cold-bloodedness and control that defies explanation. Was it to delay discovery? To make it seem as though the family was merely away? Or was it something far more sinister, a macabre ritual of living among the dead, a twisted mockery of family life? We will never know the killer's motives for these 4 horrifying days. What we do know is that during this time, the murderer walked freely among the remnants of the Gruber family, their lives extinguished, while the world outside remained blissfully unaware of the unspeakable horror unfolding within the walls of Hinterkaifeck. The presence of the killer, tending to the farm and living among the deceased, adds a layer of psychological terror to an already gruesome crime. The unsettling quiet of Hinterkaifeck finally began to alarm the villagers by Tuesday, April 4th. The mail had continued to pile up, and Kazilia Gruber had now missed school for 3 days straight. These were things that simply did not happen with the Grubers, who, despite their reclusive nature, stuck to a strict routine. Local farmer Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who happened to be Victoria Gabriel's former lover and the rumored father of Joseph, was one of the first to grow concerned. He dispatched his 2 young sons, Johann and Joseph, to the farm to see if they could find out what was going on. When the boys arrived, they tried the doors and knocked, but there was no answer. They too noticed the unusual silence and the uncollected mail. They saw no one, but they did hear the mournful mooing of the cattle from the barn, a sound that, in retrospect, seemed to carry an urgent plea. Returning home, the boys reported their findings to their father. This further fueled Schlittenbauer's unease. He gathered a small group of other villagers, Michael Pohl and his half-brother George Gregor, and together, they decided to make a proper investigation of the farm. As the men approached Hinterkaifeck, the first thing they noticed was the utter stillness. No barking dog, no sounds of children playing, just the lowing of the animals. They tried the doors to the house, which were locked. Looking through a window, they saw no one. The men then went to the barn, and it was there, in the gloom of the stable, that the horror first revealed itself. Near the entrance to the barn, they discovered the bodies of Andreas Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, the elder Kazilia Gruber, and little Kazilia Gabriel. All four were piled on top of each other, partially hidden by hay, their faces disfigured beyond recognition by savage blows to the head. It was a sight that no man could ever forget, a tableau of unimaginable violence. The air was thick with the smell of death and something else, something metallic and sickening. Frozen in shock, the men cautiously moved into the main house. They found the body of 2-year-old Joseph in his crib, tucked in as if sleeping, but his small head terribly injured. And finally, in her bed in the maid's room, they found Maria Baumgartner, also brutally murdered. The scene was one of utter devastation. The silence that had hung over Hinterkaifeck for 4 days was now broken by the horrified gasps of the discovery party. Lorenz Schlittenbauer immediately sent one of his sons to alert the police in the nearby town of Schrobenhausen. The grim news quickly spread, first through the small village of Grobern, and then like wildfire across Bavaria. The remote farm, known only to a few, was about to become the center of one of Germany's most infamous unsolved mysteries. The silence was broken, but the questions were only just beginning. News of the massacre traveled slowly in 1922. It wasn't until Wednesday, April 5th, that the police arrived at Hinterkaifeck. A small team, led by Inspector George Reingruber from Munich, was dispatched to the remote farm. The local police had already secured the scene, or at least tried to. In those days, crime scene preservation was not as sophisticated as it is today. Villagers, curious and horrified, had already trampled through the farmyard, eager to catch a glimpse of the tragedy. Many people had entered the house and barn, inadvertently destroying crucial evidence. When Inspector Reingruber and his team finally arrived, they were confronted with a scene of absolute devastation and an immediate sense of bewilderment. The bodies were still where they had been found. The first task was the grim process of examining the victims. Dr. Johann Baptist Aumler, a district medical officer, performed a rudimentary autopsy at the scene. He confirmed the cause of death for all 6 victims was severe trauma to the head, consistent with blows from a heavy, blunt object, later identified as a mattock. The mattock itself was found later, hidden in the attic, covered in blood and hair, confirming it as the murder weapon. The initial investigation quickly established that robbery did not appear to be the primary motive. While some valuables were missing, such as a gold chain and a small amount of cash, a significant sum of money, around 1,000 marks, a considerable amount at the time, was found hidden under floorboards in the house, untouched. This immediately pointed away from a simple theft. The way the killer had stayed on the farm, feeding the animals and eating the family's food, also didn't fit the profile of a typical burglar. The police observed the strange condition of the farm. The animals were fed. The fire in the hearth was cold, but it had clearly been lit recently. The beds had been slept in. It was evident that someone had spent several days at the farm after the murders. This detail horrified the investigators and sent a chill down their spines. Who would live among the dead? And why? The lack of forced entry was another puzzling detail. The doors were locked from the inside when the discovery party arrived. This strongly suggested that the killer either had a key, perhaps the missing house key Andreas Gruber had reported weeks earlier, or was known to the family and allowed inside. This shifted the focus of the investigation towards someone familiar with the Grubers, someone from the local area, or even someone who had been living on the farm in secret. The isolated nature of Hinterkaifeck meant that the circle of potential suspects was small, yet the answers remained elusive. The initial findings raised more questions than they answered, setting the stage for one of history's most frustrating and baffling murder investigations. The case was already proving to be exceptionally difficult, a labyrinth of strange clues and unanswered horrors. The official autopsies were carried out by the district physician, Dr. Aumler, who noted the extreme violence used on all 6 victims. The blows from the mattock were so powerful that they had crushed skulls and left horrific wounds. The victims, especially the adults found in the barn, were unrecognizable. One particularly disturbing detail emerged from the autopsy of the 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel. Investigators found strands of her own hair clutched tightly in her small hand, pulled out by the roots. This horrifying detail suggested that the little girl had been awake and conscious, struggling, or perhaps crawling in terror just before or during the attack. The knowledge that a child was aware of the impending doom adds an unbearable layer of tragedy to the crime. Another important point raised during the medical examination was the sequence of events. Based on the decomposition, it was confirmed that the family members in the barn, Andreas, the elder Kazilia, Victoria, and the younger Kazilia, had all died roughly at the same time, late Friday night. Maria Baumgartner and little Joseph were also killed around this time, or shortly thereafter. The medical findings corroborated the theory that the killer had dispatched the victims sequentially and silently, giving no one time to scream or fight back effectively, though the girl's hair suggested a brief, frantic struggle. The investigation was immediately plagued by a critical piece of missing evidence: the key. Andreas Gruber had reported the key to the entire farmhouse missing weeks earlier. This was the key that unlocked the main house, the key that allowed the killer easy, silent access. Despite extensive searching, the key was never found. Police theorized that the killer had either stolen the key weeks before or had somehow gotten a copy made. The missing key solidified the theory that the crime was premeditated and committed by someone with a deliberate, calculated plan. Adding to the confusion was the condition of the bodies in the barn. They were stacked. The killer had deliberately moved the 4 bodies and piled them on top of one another, partially covering them with hay and an old door. This action suggested an attempt to hide the bodies, or perhaps an attempt to delay their discovery. Why spend the time and effort stacking the bodies in the dark after such a brutal act, unless the killer intended to stay and buy time? This macabre arrangement, combined with the fact that the farm was tended to for 4 days, pointed towards a deeply disturbed mind, or someone incredibly confident in their ability to evade capture. The brutality was senseless, and the subsequent actions were simply bizarre, leaving the investigators with no clear psychological profile to follow. With no clear motive for robbery, the police turned their attention to the Gruber family's troubled past and the deep-seated local grudges. Given the isolated location and the nature of the crime, a planned ambush, it was highly likely the killer was someone from the immediate area, someone who knew the family's routine and the layout of the farm. The first and most immediate suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man who helped discover the bodies. He was Victoria Gabriel's former lover and the likely father of 2-year-old Joseph. Schlittenbauer had been involved in bitter disputes with Andreas Gruber over money and the child's legitimacy. On the day of the discovery, Schlittenbauer's behavior was strange. He was one of the first to enter the house, and he claimed to have tried to open the door to the maid's room, a room he should have had no knowledge of, with a key. When police questioned him about this key, he quickly changed his story, claiming he had just been fumbling with the lock. This suspicious behavior, combined with the love triangle and the feuds with Andreas Gruber, placed Schlittenbauer squarely at the top of the suspect list for the local police. Another compelling suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. He had allegedly died in the trenches during World War I, but his body was never recovered. Rumors persisted in the village that Carl had not died but was roaming the countryside. Some theories suggested he discovered the incestuous relationship between his wife and father-in-law, Andreas, and returned seeking violent revenge. However, the police were officially convinced Carl Gabriel was dead, and there was no evidence to place him near Hinterkaifeck. The police also investigated a former maid who had left months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. She spoke of unsettling noises and being watched, reinforcing the idea that someone may have been lurking around the farm for a long time. They also questioned several drifters and vagrants who had passed through the area, but these leads went nowhere. The most bizarre suspect was actually a pair of brothers, the Gump brothers, who were known cattle thieves and had recently moved into the area. Police were later informed by a witness that one of the Gump brothers, when intoxicated, had openly bragged about committing the Hinterkaifeck murders. He claimed they did it to get money, which contradicted the crime scene evidence, but the police took the claim seriously and pursued it. Despite interviewing over 100 suspects and following every rumor, the evidence against any single person remained purely circumstantial. The investigation quickly became mired in local gossip, old feuds, and dark speculation, with no physical evidence, no fingerprints, and no eyewitnesses to definitively point to the killer. The sheer complexity of the family dynamics and local rivalries meant everyone had a theory, but no one had the truth. After the initial chaos of the discovery, the police focused their efforts on a meticulous search of the property, hoping to find the vital clue that everyone else had missed. The search proved fruitful, but the finds only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The murder weapon was finally located in the attic of the farmhouse. It was a farm tool called a mattock or German pickaxe, typically used for digging and chopping. It was stained with blood and strands of hair, a horrific confirmation of its use. Finding the weapon in the attic, where old Andreas Gruber had reported hearing the strange noises weeks earlier, was a major breakthrough. It strongly suggested the killer had been hiding up there, using the cramped, dark space as a surveillance post and a hiding place for the weapon. This was the final, sickening confirmation that the family had been living for days, possibly weeks, under the same roof as their future murderer. The attic search revealed another strange detail. Police found evidence that someone had been eating and sheltering there. There were loose tiles that had been deliberately moved to create a small viewing hole down into the living areas of the house. From this vantage point, the killer could have observed the family's daily routine, learned their habits, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. But the most famous and baffling piece of physical evidence found in the house was discovered in the kitchen. In a saucer on the kitchen table, police found freshly burned cigarette butts. The killer had stayed on the premises, enjoying the warmth of the farmhouse and the spoils of their violence, and had a smoke while the 6 victims lay dead just feet away. The cigarette brand was one that was not commonly sold in the immediate vicinity, raising the possibility that the killer was a traveling worker or someone from a distant town. In a heartbreaking detail that further complicated the timeline, the family dog, which had been tied up outside, was later found to have been fed recently, proving that the killer was actively caring for the livestock during the 4 days they remained on the farm. They were not only hiding in the house, but actively playing the role of the farmer, making the scene appear normal from a distance. The mattock, the attic hideout, and the cigarette butts were concrete pieces of evidence, yet they pointed in a million directions. The killer had been in the house, watching, waiting, and returning after the deed was done. The physical evidence spoke of a cold, calculating individual who was intimately familiar with the farm and the family schedule, yet someone who left no traceable fingerprint or clear connection to any of the primary suspects. The Hinterkaifeck farm was a perfect crime scene, isolated, full of secrets, and utterly confusing. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders quickly became a case study in how not to handle a major crime. From the very beginning, the police were hampered by a combination of rural inexperience, the initial lack of respect for the crime scene, and the sheer volume of contradictory local testimony. When the police arrived, the farm had already been completely contaminated. Hundreds of curious villagers, journalists, and amateur sleuths had walked through the house, the barn, and the surrounding grounds, completely destroying any potential footprints, fibers, or trace evidence. Locals even moved the bodies before the police could properly photograph and document the scene, based on the belief that a quick burial was necessary for the souls of the dead. This contamination made it impossible to gather clean physical evidence, leaving the police reliant on circumstantial clues and witness statements, which were often unreliable or based on decades of village gossip. The police response was also heavily criticized for its initial focus. Instead of meticulously reconstructing the events of the murder night, they became obsessed with the family's dark past and the local feuds, particularly the incest rumor involving Andreas Gruber and his daughter, Victoria. They operated under the assumption that the killer must be a disgruntled local seeking revenge or a former lover, diverting crucial resources away from exploring other possibilities, such as a traveling killer or a mentally disturbed stranger. Furthermore, the 6 victims were decapitated shortly after the autopsies, which was a common practice at the time. Their heads were sent to Munich for further examination by clairvoyants and phrenologists, specialists who studied skull shapes, hoping for some supernatural or anatomical insight into the killer's identity. This unorthodox and unscientific approach wasted time and resources and showed how desperate the authorities were for answers. The heads were eventually lost during World War II, a grim final chapter for the physical remains of the Gruber family. The case instantly captured the public imagination in Germany. The idea of a secluded farm family being wiped out by a silent, invisible killer who then lived among their corpses was the stuff of nightmares. Newspapers sensationalized the details, giving the killer nicknames and publishing wild, unfounded theories. The pressure on the police to solve the crime was immense, but the investigation was already fundamentally flawed. Without clean evidence, the police were fighting a losing battle against the silence of the farm and the contamination left by the public frenzy. In the years following the murders, the police, lacking physical evidence, relied heavily on aggressive interrogation tactics. The case was formally closed and reopened numerous times between 1922 and 1986, with over 100 suspects questioned, sometimes repeatedly over decades. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the police's primary suspect for many years. His suspicious behavior, his early arrival at the farm, his claim about trying to unlock the maid's room, and his documented feuds with Andreas Gruber made him an easy target. The police subjected Schlittenbauer to intense questioning, trying to break him down and get a confession. However, Schlittenbauer steadfastly maintained his innocence until his death in 1959. Interestingly, decades later, a local story surfaced claiming that Schlittenbauer, on his deathbed, admitted that he did arrive at the farm before the discovery party, found the bodies himself, but then moved them to make it look like the discovery was collective, so he wouldn't be accused. While this story is unconfirmed, it certainly fits his suspicious actions and the arrangement of the bodies. Beyond Schlittenbauer, the investigation was plagued by false confessions. In the wake of a sensational murder, it is common for disturbed individuals to seek notoriety. Several people came forward claiming to be the Hinterkaifeck killer. One of the most notable false confessions came from a man named Karl Eder, who had worked as a farmhand near the Gruber property. He confessed to a cellmate in 1926 that he was involved in the murders, claiming he and his brother had committed the crime because of a dispute over wages. Police investigated the claim, but Karl Eder later recanted, and the evidence didn't align with the facts of the crime. Another sensational, though later discounted, theory centered around Adolf Gump, one of the two brothers accused of bragging about the crime. Adolf was eventually convicted and executed for an unrelated murder, but his family was also deeply involved in local criminal activity. The police heavily pursued the Gump theory, but again, the evidence was flimsy and lacked solid proof linking them to the Hinterkaifeck farm on the night of the murders. The police were often too eager to believe confessions or rumors that fit their narrative of a local killer driven by revenge or greed. This resulted in tunnel vision, where they failed to seriously consider outside possibilities. The constant questioning and the media spotlight ruined the lives of many innocent people in the local area, forcing them to live under the shadow of suspicion. Despite all the effort, the case remained cold, trapped between rumors of incestuous revenge, disputes over money, and the phantom footsteps in the snow. As the years passed and all local leads dried up, investigators began to reluctantly consider scenarios that involved someone who was not a local resident. The evidence of the strange cigarette butts and the lack of a clear financial motive began to point towards a transient killer, perhaps a traveling worker or a demobilized soldier from the war. The theory of a traveling killer suggests that the murderer was simply passing through the isolated area, perhaps needing shelter, food, or simply a place to lie low. The killer might have been driven by a violent psychotic episode or a desperate need to survive, eliminating the family purely to secure the farm as a temporary hiding spot. This would explain the killer's willingness to stay on the property for 4 days. They were using the farm as a safe haven before moving on. Furthermore, the brutal overkill suggested a deeply personal rage, but that rage could have been displaced. Some criminologists later suggested that the killer had a generalized hatred or a history of violence, and that the Grubers simply became targets of opportunity. The methodical nature of the attacks, luring the victims one by one to the barn, required incredible control and calculation, traits that often define a serial offender rather than a simple local driven by a fit of jealousy. A key piece of evidence supporting a non-local killer was a strange event that happened a few months after the murders. The farm was eventually torn down, and during the demolition, a small, silver locket was found hidden in the floorboards. This was believed to be the same locket that little Kazilia had shown her friends shortly before the murder, claiming she found it in the yard. This discovery could mean that the killer dropped the locket, perhaps belonged to them or someone they knew, during an early scouting mission, and then retrieved it or hid it inside the house after the murders. The locket was never publicly identified or linked to any person, but it served as a haunting reminder of the killer's unseen presence. The police never officially settled on a motive. Was it revenge for the incest? Was it a dispute over money or land? Was it a random act of violence by a vagrant? Ultimately, the official conclusion was that the motive was unknown. The most enduring and terrifying theory is that the killer was driven by the desire to live secretly, to observe, and to control. The murder itself was the means to achieve the chilling goal of becoming the silent, sole ruler of the desolate farm, if only for 4 days. Decades passed, and the Hinterkaifeck case became less a police investigation and more a historical legend, a grim piece of German folklore. However, in 2007, the case received a remarkable second chance. The police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck, Bavaria, decided to use the Hinterkaifeck files as a cold case exercise for its final year students. This was a unique opportunity to apply modern investigative techniques to a century-old mystery. The students, under the supervision of a veteran homicide inspector, meticulously re-examined every piece of original evidence, every witness statement, and every theory. They focused particularly on the clothing of the victims and the items found at the scene, hoping that forensic science might yield results where old-fashioned detective work had failed. The most promising avenue was DNA technology. The original police reports mentioned several pieces of clothing that had been preserved, including coats and scars belonging to the victims and possibly the killers. While the bodies themselves were long buried, or in the case of the heads, lost, there was a faint hope that trace DNA could still be extracted from these artifacts. Unfortunately, the age of the evidence and the poor preservation methods of 1922 proved to be insurmountable obstacles. The clothes had been stored in suboptimal conditions for over 80 years, leading to degradation. Furthermore, the massive contamination of the crime scene in 1922 meant that any DNA found was likely a mix of the victims, the investigators, the curious villagers, and the actual killer, making identification nearly impossible. Despite these setbacks, the student investigators managed to reach a unanimous conclusion regarding the identity of the killer. Based purely on the meticulous reconstruction of the crime, the patterns of attack, the sequence of events, and the alibis of the main suspects, the students named their prime suspect. However, due to German privacy laws and the lack of concrete, scientifically verifiable evidence, the name of the suspect was never officially released to the public. The police stated that while they had identified the most probable killer, there was not enough evidence to successfully bring a prosecution. The case remained open, but essentially concluded, with the identity of the murderer kept secret in the police files. In 1923, just a year after the massacre, the decision was made to tear down the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. The place was deemed too cursed, too horrifying, and too contaminated to ever be lived in again. The villagers of Grobern did not want the constant, grim reminder of the atrocity. The farm was systematically demolished, brick by brick, until nothing remained but the bare earth and the silence. During the demolition, a few final, haunting clues were discovered. Besides the silver locket mentioned earlier, workers also unearthed the missing mattock handle, which had snapped off the head during the violent attack. They also found small caches of food hidden in the attic space, further cementing the theory that the killer had prepared for a long stay. The final, unsettling discovery was a deep impression in the dirt floor of the old pigsty, leading some to believe the killer may have spent time hiding among the animals before moving into the attic. The land itself was eventually sold. A small, unassuming stone cross was erected on the spot where the farmhouse once stood, serving as the only marker for the 6 lives violently taken. The victims were buried in the nearby Weidhofen cemetery, but because of the horrific nature of their deaths and the subsequent decapitation for analysis, they were buried without their heads, a final, macabre indignity. The story of Hinterkaifeck quickly passed into local legend, becoming a modern ghost story. People reported seeing shadows, hearing strange footsteps, and feeling an icy coldness when they approached the location. The remote silence of the place, once the stage for a perfect crime, became the sound of the unanswered questions. The legacy of the murders is one of total frustration. It is a mystery without a solution, a horror without a face. Every single piece of evidence, the footsteps, the missing key, the noises in the attic, the cigarette butts, the piled bodies, and the killer living among the dead, is a contradiction. The case forces us to confront the terrifying idea that a killer can be meticulous, calculating, and cold-blooded enough to execute a whole family and then simply walk away, disappearing back into the quiet fabric of normal life forever. The Hinterkaifeck murders have remained unsolved for over a century, defying the best efforts of police, modern forensic experts, and countless true crime enthusiasts. This is more than just a historical footnote. It is a permanent scar on the history of Bavaria. The truth, in all its simplicity and horror, likely lies in one of two main scenarios. Scenario 1. The local killer. The murderer was someone known to the Grubers, driven by revenge, jealousy, or the dark secret of the incestuous relationship. This killer had the missing key, knew the routines, and used the cover of local anonymity. This fits the motive of revenge and the immediate access to the farm. Scenario 2. The transient killer. The murderer was a stranger, a soldier, or a traveling worker who stumbled upon the isolated farm. They sought shelter, were discovered, and killed the family purely out of necessity to ensure their own survival or concealment. This fits the evidence of the strange cigarette butts, the lack of a clear financial motive, and the brutality that seemed disproportionate to a simple local feud. What makes the case so endlessly compelling is the sheer efficiency and bizarre aftermath of the crime. The killer managed to lure 6 people, one by one, to the same isolated location in a barn, using only the sound of a mattock on flesh, without alerting the others. They then spent 4 days living a false life on the farm, feeding the animals and keeping warm, a chilling demonstration of psychopathic control. The official police files on the Hinterkaifeck murders were finally closed and sealed. The 6 people who died that night are now just names in a century-old file. Andreas Kazilia, Sr., Victoria Kazilia, Jr., Joseph, and Maria. The small, desolate patch of land where they lived and died remains silent. It stands as a powerful reminder that sometimes the darkness that descends on humanity is so profound, so absolute, that it swallows the truth whole, leaving behind nothing but whispers in the dark and the profound, unanswered question: who killed the Grubers? The silence of Hinterkaifeck is the loudest part of this story. 6 lives erased in the space of an hour, and a killer who walked away and was never seen again. They lived among the dead for 4 days. They ate the family's food, they slept in their beds, and then they vanished into the spring night of 1922. We're left with the footsteps in the snow that led nowhere, the missing key, the sounds in the attic, and the overwhelming feeling that the perfect killer is the one you never even suspect. It makes you wonder, if a complete family can be wiped out so easily, in total isolation, and the killer is never caught, how many other cold cases are out there, hiding in plain sight? What do you think happened? Was it a neighbor, consumed by rage and jealousy? Or was it a transient, a phantom from the post-war chaos? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you're as chilled by this story as I am, please hit that like button, subscribe for more true crime mysteries, and share this video with someone who loves a truly baffling cold case. Until next time, stay safe and always watch your back.